Okay, great. So good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. As Bill said in his introduction, I'm joined by Chris Fitzgerald, who recently started as our postdoctoral fellow on this 2.5-year project. The talk, entitled, sorry Matt, we lost you there, a multimodal analysis of virtual meetings, is really an attempt to give you a flavour of the research we're doing. The title itself was inspired by just some initial data we've gathered of a company's meeting, or a meeting in the workplace. And this phrase, sorry Matt, we've lost you there, it's indicative of language we've become used to. We wouldn't have said something like that, whereas now, it's a daily occurrence to tell someone, in an online environment, we've lost them, or ask about legacy hands and so on. So, our meeting spaces have changed drastically. And our project received funding from the IRC AHRC, that's a Arts Humanities Research Council in the UK. So it was an Ireland UK Digital Humanities funding call. They funded 11 projects, and they got about 50 submissions. So we were really lucky to get funded, and we pushed the budget to the max. So we got close to 700,000 in funding. And the co-principal investigator with me is Dr. Dawn Knight of Cardiff University. And we were also joined with a number of collaborating investigators from UL, UCD, where we've two, University of Nottingham, Swansea University, and Aberdeen. The terms of the funding call also required us to have external stakeholders, basically people in the real world who could benefit from this actual research. So it's public money. You're going to invest all this money in this research. What is the public good of that research? And so we had to find willing people in the business and cultural sphere who might actually be interested in helping us shape this research and to gain from it in terms of training materials and other insights. Now, and here's a list of the people who joined in advance. Now, the timeline for the project was tight. It was the call opens and it all has to happen. You have to get all those partners together in the academic sphere and outside of academia. Don't normally have to go outside academia, God forbid, to go out to the real world. So what really stood to us was having the IVAX, that's the research centre that I've been involved in for years, having that network. And for years and years, I've been getting networking funding through the seed funding that the RGSO puts out. And that's allowed me to create a network and build relationships through the seed funding, through symposia, conferences, and really this grant wouldn't have happened without that capacity that had been built over the years. So instantly we had the academic partners. It was literally half a day, and we know who our team is, we know what's happening, we know who's in, and then we were able to get on with finding external partners through that network. So that's just something I wanted to flag, the importance of availing of that networking funding, because it will ultimately lead to grant bids and funding. So our project then, what is it about? Well, the title of the project, and you know how titles, you have to try and tick all of the boxes with the title, so it often becomes a very dense thing. So it's officially called Interactional Variation Online, Harnessing emerging technologies in digital humanities to analyze online discourse in different workplace contexts. We had to get the word digital humanities in, and we were just kind of trying to cram as much of the right words in there. But really, what is it about? Well, I'll start by explaining through pictures. So first of all, what happens when we change our workplace from this to this, and we take away all of this? So, people refer to this digital pivot, where we seem almost gracefully to have pivoted to an online space to work and to meet. But within academia and within the world of business and other spheres, what happens when you turn your meeting space into a virtual space? What happens to turn taking? Who can speak when? Who decides who speaks when and for how long? How do meetings open and close? What's that awkward bit before the official opening where you're doing small talk, or maybe you just log in at the exact moment where it's going to start because maybe you want to avoid that. The awkwardness of ending a meeting, everyone's scrambling for the leave button. Bye. That, you know, all of these, this is new territory in terms of collaborative communication. Also, are these meetings now much more transactional? Do we get more down to business, and do we do far less of the relational type of interaction? For example, who had COVID? How was your holiday? Congrats on your engagement. Love your talk. You know, that's all taken out largely in this space. The sidebars before the meeting, the sidebars after the meeting. Also the roles within the meetings, how do they impact the communication? So the person, the power role holder, will obviously control a lot of the who speaks for how long and when and in what order. So the power semantic within a meeting is very important. Now, not all meetings are hierarchical in terms of being chaired, but even still, there's going to be a power semantic. Is there a gender variable? Do women speak less and for shorter periods, for example, or do males? Is there an ethnicity variable that has an impact also on access to the floor? So these are some of the really interesting questions that we're seeking to answer. To do that, we have to gather actual data, recordings, real recordings from our partners of their meetings in different spheres. And we'll also be collecting other types of data. So the key concerns then for us, what comprises successful and unsuccessful communication online? How does communication, both verbally and non-verbally, manifest in the online workplace interaction in different contexts? By different contexts, I mean, you know, small meetings, informal meetings, formal meetings, big meetings, etc. How can we facilitate more research on this type of data? So the last one is more for our own research community, whereas the other two are more for everyone's benefit. So in our own corpus linguistics community, there are a lot of barriers for us to look at audiovisual data, which Chris will talk about more in a minute. So our aims then boil down to, one, trying to enhance our understanding of language use in the virtual workplace. And really, that's about gaining insight into the barriers and also the potentials of communication in this sphere. And secondly, then, as I say, for our own research community in the area of corpus linguistics, we want to try and scaffold and enable better research into online communication, because it's technically very difficult to transcribe what's actually happening. Right now I'm talking, I'm moving my hands, I might be moving my head. How do you get that onto a transcript? And Chris will talk more about that in a minute. Might actually be your turn, Chris, is it? Yeah, it is. I'm handing over now to Chris.
Yeah, so we've taken a number of steps and foundational steps really to date in achieving these aims. And so these include staff recruitment, including myself, and team building, some stakeholder engagement. So with those groups that Anne mentioned earlier, a fairly arduous ethical clearance process that Anne was heavily involved in, which was an interinstitutional process, which made it even more complex. And then outlining and identifying potential data sources, which I'll be getting to in a second. And then surveying the baseline of behaviors through questionnaire data. And then all of the gathering of this data, which I'll get to now. So our core data, I guess, there are a number of strands to our data, but the real core is our meeting recordings, and that leading to us creating a multimodal corpus. I'll get to what that means in a second. But not only are we looking at these recorded virtual meetings, but we're also looking at questionnaire data, which is still live, in which we ask targeted questions about people's experience of working online. And we have a nice spread of respondents to this from a range of industries. So this gives us a good insight into a number of aspects of people's attitudes to working from home. I'll get to some of those as well in a second to give you a sense of what we're looking at there. And we're going to follow this up with interviews to get a deeper understanding of these a bit more qualitatively. And then additional data to this is some social media data, which we're looking at to gather some idea of sentiment around working from home. So I'll go through each one of these in turn, and I'll start with the latter of these, the social media data. And we're gathering this from Twitter, and those of you who are on Twitter will have a sense of the kind of discourse that happens up there and the But something that's interesting to us as well, because we're looking at multimodal discourse analysis, is the blending of other types of media, so images with GIFs or emojis, and as you can see, an awful lot of tweets nowadays, they do contain this type of media, so we're looking at blending the two of those to understand deeper meanings of these tweets. So what we're looking at, I've gathered a corpus of over 300 tweets now that mention working from home. And that gives us a bit of a sense anyway, you know, even though there are limitations to analysing social media data, but it does give us some kind of a gauge of sentiment to supplement our other data. And I suppose those of you who are on Twitter will, you know, not be too surprised that there are extreme opinions expressed here, and it's kind of polar opinions from those who hate working from home to those who think it's the best thing ever. And then the kind of themes that are coming up quite a lot are, you know, pets as a source of comfort when working from home. Actually, our data, video data so far, pets do show up in that too. And so then other tweets referring to the stress of working from home and the things related to that. So people working from home with young families or those who live alone are more likely to express negative sentiment towards it. So that's some of our social media data, and you know, we're starting to look at that in a bit more in depth now. The survey data that Anne mentioned, among other areas, has given us an insight into both what works well and what doesn't work for people engaging in virtual meetings. And we can see here some of the themes which come up frequently as positives to working from home, and I'm sure this might be relatable to some of you as well. Many of these refer to the ease and convenience of working from home, facilitated by technological tools and the platforms used. So you can see, you know, accessibility to online is great for seminars, easy to continue work and listen in, convenient to set up. A lot of these about the technical side, technical aspects of working from home. The idea that as sessions are recorded, most of the time one does not need to travel anywhere. The chat box option, giving people a place to respond or ask questions, reaching the whole team regardless of their location. Somebody saying that I can Google answers to my questions during the seminar without appearing rude. I can chat to other attendees without disturbing the teacher. I can eat, drink, knit during the sessions, which helps me to stay focused. So this idea of focus is sometimes a positive, but it also comes up in the negatives, as we'll see here. So, you know, here we get into, I think it gets a little bit more emotive or affective when we look at the negative side of working in the online environment. But a lot of the ubiquitous themes here, the lack of informal interaction, the lack of the kind of social side of work, the inability to brainstorm. You can't pick up the mood music of the room, you know, difficult to build team spirit, meeting people and networking again, exchanging ideas. No face-to-face, so presenter cannot see facial expressions, which is interesting for us. Hard to keep people concentrated, and then the technical aspects here as well. So slow internet can lead to confusion if sound is continually cutting out. Okay, so that's some of our data, but you know, as I said, the core of our data really is the analysis of the videos that we'll be looking at, the videos of virtual meetings. And as we mentioned, we're not just interested in the verbal aspect of this interaction, but all the other modes that co-occur with the verbal that also play a role in the success or otherwise of communication in this type of environment. So in addition to just the verbal, then we have all of these other aspects. So from the verbal up to the prosodic features of the verbal. So those are things like the rhythm, stress, intonation, moving on to the body language aspects that Anne was mentioning, and you know, all of these parts of that, and there are many others too, so things like hand gestures, facial expressions, gaze, which I'll give you some examples of that in a second. And the text that I'm referring to down here is the kind of text that we might be using today, you know, in this meeting, people putting things into the chat and the sidebar, and all of that coming together to create successful or unsuccessful communication in this medium. Okay, so let's just look at a few examples of these then. So when we're looking at hand gestures, for example, we can see here from our data a range of hand gestures. These are just screenshots from our pilot data, and a number of these gestures, of course, might be somewhat unique to meetings in this mode of communication. I'm not sure if we'll be doing these so much in face-to-face meetings, but we can see people making signals to signify a request for the floor, you know, both in the top left and the top right here. We can see single and double thumbs up. We see fingers crossed. In this case, that's to show that the participant is hoping that one of their invited guests will make it to an event. And like, even though these gestures, they are familiar to us, they may and they do occur maybe in face-to-face meetings, but they may take on a different meaning in this context and are interesting examples of communication in this environment without speaking. So these are things that we'll be really considering when we get into our transcription of our data. And so that means then that our mode of transcribing these features also needs adapting from existing annotation symbols and kind of requires a new framework to express what these gestures mean in this context. So we see here a traditional framework for annotating hand gestures, which maybe these frameworks will still be useful to us, but we think we need to consider how these translate into this context, into online virtual meetings, and gestures which may be unique to this context too, that maybe don't occur in face-to-face meetings. So we've looked at hand gestures. Let's look at what we mean by gaze then. And gaze is one of the more interesting aspects, we think, of gestures in this environment. So while eye contact, of course, is an important aspect of interpersonal communication, it's difficult to judge and uphold in these types of contexts in video mediated communication. So like we're thinking about where do we look when we're communicating with multiple people in an online context. Like if I look straight at the camera now, on your end, I might be making eye contact, but on my end, I'm not. And as the panels in these kind of discussions are set up differently for each participant, the way that they look is unique to each individual. And so one person might be looking down and left, and another might be looking up and right, and to look at the same participant. So we have typical aspects of gaze as seen here with the person at the bottom right. So this is kind of typical of this person, is that he's trying to recall a name. So we often look up when we're trying to do this. So some aspects of gaze then are translatable across the different media. So I'm just going to, on the next clip and the next slide now, I'm going to play a little clip, and hopefully this works. A symbol came up there saying that maybe the audio won't work, so I'm not sure if this will work. But what we have here anyway is just a very short clip that is an example of business meeting management. And because breakdowns of communication, they can be awkward and maybe even more awkward in this context, it can often boil down to the responsibility of the chair to manage this. And we see this here, the chair in this context is in this clip is the person in the center on the top row here. So hopefully this will work, and I might play it a couple of times because it's very short, and the whole point of this is that it's awkward and there's overlapping dialogue, so I might need to play it more than once anyway. Maybe somebody can confirm if the audio is working. It might not.
No, there's no audio there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, Bill, actually I got a message earlier on while Anne was speaking saying that the audio wasn't going to be translated, so I'm not sure if that's something we can resolve. But maybe I can just describe what happens in this clip anyway. That's probably the best way around it. It's just that the chair who was at the center on the top was trying to conduct just a little bit of a breakdown in communication where there was overlapping dialogue, where the person at the bottom right hadn't put up his hand to suggest that he wanted to take the floor. So then the responsibility was on the chair to just manage that a little bit. And the point that we're making is that it's just a little bit more complex in this situation when it's not always evident when people do want to take the floor, and then that needs to be managed a little bit more carefully. And all of the frameworks of politeness and face come into that as well. So I'm sorry that wasn't able to play. I think there's just a bit of a technical issue here. So we'll be sharing the slides anyway, so people might be able to watch it afterwards. Okay, so then again, coming back to the whole transcription process, and we can look at traditional forms of transcription, which we can see here. This is, a traditional style of conversation analysis transcription that does take into account some of these multimodal factors. We have the arrow signifying rising intonation. We have these little signifiers of pauses, the amount of time that the pauses happen, and some overlapping dialogue with the back channeling and when there's symbols in brackets here, that means that they're kind of barely audible, so like he's one of them. So some of this, of course, like this is just a representation of spoken discourse in a textual form, and that can be successful, but it does degrade somewhat from what you see in the original. And so there are tools that can help us to manage this. And one tool that we're looking at using is ELAN, which we can see here. So this is a tool that allows us to see the video in this top left panel. Then we can annotate and transcribe. And then we can see some audio wave patterns, which help us with our phonological understanding. And then at the bottom of this screenshot, you can see one of the more complex features of this are the multiple tiers, which help us to transcribe all of these different aspects of multimodal communication, including hand gestures, gaze, and all of these co-occurring. So we need multiple layers then called tiers to facilitate that. And we can see that a little bit better here. This is just this is a corpus of elderly people's communication, and these are just monologues. So even with these, you can see how complex these tiers are at the bottom. And I'll just zoom in a little bit further here so you can see here, these are all just layers of hand gestures alone. So you can imagine then that it's going to be a little bit time consuming and arduous for us to transcribe and annotate layers of, even from that clip earlier, 5 people speaking at the same time. We'll need hierarchies and tiers to annotate each of these 5 people's gaze, their hand gestures, their body movements, as well as the verbal and prosodic features. So that's something that is going to be fairly time consuming and be a big part of our study. But as I'll say in a while, it should hopefully help us to share our corpus with others then later and be a good resource and tool for others. So the challenges then facing us will be the level of detail that we do want to get into when we do come to the annotation and transcription phase of this. And this needs to be determined really by our analytical goals, which we'll need to decide from the outset. Like I said, there are standard frameworks, and while these do exist, these don't really take into account the features of online or video mediated communication like I've been discussing. There are going to be technical issues. So as we know, even like I've had today, multiplicity of technical issues may arise in virtual meetings that we need to account for in our data as well, such as people freezing. And, you know, again, to refer you to the title of the presentation, these expressions such as, sorry, Matt, we lost you there, that comes directly from our data. And, you know, this signifies the management of this in this context. Data capturing is something that we're thinking a lot about, and there are a number of popular platforms such as Teams, like we're using now, and they all have common features, but they do have features as well that, you know, that don't extend across all data, all video recording platforms. So we need to consider those as well. And then finally, our output format. So the output format of our data from ELAN will determine how we can both analyze and make accessible our corpus to others to maximize interoperability afterwards. Okay, so then just finally, we have a number of next steps that we're going to be taking. So the next things we're considering are the detailed analysis of our survey data. I showed you some extracts of that earlier, conducting follow-up interviews to those, producing initial deliverables for our website. I'll show you the website again in a second. We've started Researcher Network, which we're going to have monthly meetings of. The first one of those is next week, and if any of you might consider joining that yourself or share with others, I'll show you how to find that in a second. Then we're going to start analysis of our sample data from our stakeholders, some of which we've shown you today. Exploring tools and frames of analysis. So that tool that I showed you a second ago, ELAN, we'll probably focusing on using that, but we might integrate other tools as well. And then producing training materials, which we'll be sharing across our website for others. Okay, so like I said, you'll be able to find some of these as we're creating them up on the website, ivohub.com, and you can follow us on Twitter too. And now we'll welcome any questions or comments that you might have. Thanks very much.